Welcome to Helping an Organisation Thrive. Today I have the pleasure of Dr. Torben Norby. Welcome to you, Torben.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good to see you. You are the CEO and co-founder of People and Performance, I should say, an expert in contextual leadership with over 2 decades of experience developing high-performing international organisations. And no surprising, what we'll be talking about this morning, we're going to be talking about and exploring contextual leadership, why it's important and how you can use that as a leader. But before we get into that, Torben, I want to ask you, what do you love about what you do?
So what I really love about what I do, and the reason I became a consultant originally, is that I really like to see organizations thrive, to make people come together and succeed with achieving the endeavor that they're on, whether that is the running performance of an organization or that's going through transformation. So this experience of the importance of leadership in regards to connecting engagement to the right efforts in order to achieve the goals, that's basically the gist of what I really enjoy, and that's the reason I keep thriving, meeting new organizations and working with sometimes a bit wicked problems or challenges for the organizations that I meet.
And when did you realize that's what you love about what you do and working with organizations and consulting in that way?
So actually, I right after high school, I went to the army. I wanted to be an NCO, an uncommissioned officer. After that, I took officers training, and that's when my interest into leadership sparked, really, because I found out how important it is. And I was involved in a couple of building up new units in the army. I left the army because I wanted to pursue this interest in leadership, learn more about that. Went into retail, got to know the civilian world. And that's where I really got this interest because I work with leadership development, with organizational development. And after about 5 years in retail, working with different departments and functions, I shifted into an international business doing heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, but responsible for large-scale transformation. And that's where my interest really sparked. That was the foundation for me deciding to become a consultant, because I met organizations in Asia, in the US, all over Europe, helping them with their part of the organizational journey. So that driving transformation in different contexts really led to me becoming a consultant in 2007, and I've never looked back. So that's where it comes from.
And you obviously in the military. It'd be interesting to understand just have you found a difference in military sort of leadership versus the civilian type of leadership, and what's been your experience of that?
So absolutely. So there are two sides to that. One, the civilian strategy and leadership work has taken a lot of inspiration from the army, from the armed forces over the or through history. And the other side is that yes, there is a difference because of a lot of contextual factors. So in the army, when you're doing operations, there's a lot of risk intensity. There's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of dynamism in the battlefield. That means that you need to build a way of leading that allows a lot of freedom of operation, but at the same time that you have a really sharp alignment around the standing operating procedures so that you don't commit mistakes and everyone can predict how our own units act at the same time as the battlefield is very unpredictable. That means that leading through intent, for example, comes out of the army, where you set up the frames, you empower people, you ask them to develop the plan and take responsibility for that, because only they can make the right decisions close to what's going on. So leading through intent is a very clear heritage from the army into civilian life. But when you get into leadership in the more civilian setting, the consequences are different. Of course, you've got high reliability organizations like nuclear power plants or oil rigs, where there's also a high risk intensity, but it is a difference. And that's exactly what sparked my interest, that this difference in context, because it requires different parts of leadership, different leadership approaches. So I need to match my leadership to the context to be effective. So yes, there are differences.
Yeah, and I think I've always had a perception, or people perhaps have a perception, interesting, you sort of perhaps dispelled a little bit of that, where in the military it's very much command and control because of the nature of the high risk, and there's a lot of standard operating procedures going on. But you talked about that whole empowering side. Has the military changed, or is it never been command and control, your view?
So basically, very, very rude separation between two mindsets, command and control, and then leading through intent. And what happened in the 18th century was that there was a shift in tactics and strategy towards leading through intent, coming out of the learnings in the Prussian army, and that evolved into focusing on empowering people, but keeping the strong alignment of the standing operating procedures. And that has actually led to the doctrine of NATO, which is called mission command, where you try to release the power of autonomy and initiative in the battlefield, but at the same time that you keep very, very clear ways of coordinating, preparing, running operations. So that's the command and control, which coexists with this high level of autonomy, which gives you the flexibility and initiative in the battlefield. So it's an interesting question, because you need command and control, but at the same time, you need that leading through intent, so people can make the best judgment calls very close to the dangers that they face.
I mean, you've already started to touch on it about contextual leadership, and I think it'd be helpful for people to hear your definition, your perspective, what contextual leadership is, or remind people, and how it might differ between sort of more traditional leadership approaches.
Absolutely. So contextual leadership basically relies on three different disciplines. The first is to understand the context that you're in. So identify the few crucial factors that really have a high impact on your ability to perform, and that have a guiding effect on what you need to do as a leader. So understand the leadership context. We can unpack that. Then I need to match my leadership to be effective in those settings. And there are two levers in that. There's the opening closing balance. So how much do I open to reinterpretation, initiative, doing it in different ways? And what are the closed parts of this? So what are the standards and procedures I need to follow? And that balance I need to strike so it matches the context. The other one is the directing, sharing. And that's exactly the balance we talked about in the Army. So the sharing leadership has taken a lot of interest over the past couple of decades, because people can assume a lot of responsibility and take that empowerment and act that out, and you get a lot more out of the potential of an organization when you do that. But at the same time, you need to know as a leader when you move towards directing and take the judgment calls, so that you know that in this unforeseen or this foggy environment where you can't really foresee what's going to happen, you might need to be directing, take the judgment calls, whereas in other settings you want to empower the front line so that they can make the decisions. So those two balances you need to strike. So understand leadership context, match your leadership to be effective. And the last very important part of contextual leadership is shaping the context to promote performance and engagement. And you do that by working with the structures and the cultures based on your understanding of the external environment and the organizational intentions, and by looking at the people base. And then you start working with that, involving people in making the procedures work in the right way, in building the parts of the culture that is most crucial for you. So if I'm in a widespread organization, that means dispersed over a lot of geography, I need to work with the empowerment, but at the same time with the common ground. These are cultural components, and I need to involve people in that. I need to work with that. So understand the context, understand what it requires from you as a leader, match your leadership to be effective, and shape the way your organization work on the structural side, cultural side, to best match the context so that you get the best out of people.
That's a really helpful explanation. Thank you for that. It really is, I think, helpful for people to understand that. And I think people probably are doing that in some form of approach to the leadership. They're perhaps just not probably using the word contextual leadership. And we talk about the context we're in, and that feels like at the moment very fluid. And I think that's even more of a challenge. I mean, I get the understand the context, but how as leaders do we grapple with that constant change and uncertainty and change and evolution that's happening, whether that's from external forces or from internal aspects from the organization as well? Because I think we're in times that are incredibly uncertain, aren't they?
I agree. The thing that a leadership team or a management team should do in regards to this is that in every organizational setting, we need to lead from the intentions in the organization. So understand, are we driving efficient operation and trying to yield the maximum return on resources? Are we trying to innovate and change? How important is purpose? And what is our people strategy? So understanding those and comparing them to the external environment, where you now talk about more dynamism. So things are changing faster and in unpredictable patterns. As we can't really predict where is all that customs war going, what's the political environment. So that makes it unpredictable. It makes it highly complex. And that means that those two drivers need to be met with internal responses. So in this case, the management team needs to discuss, how do we build the right requisite agility? So how do we set our organization up to respond fast enough by decentralizing certain decisions, but at the same time say, based on the risk picture on the outside, we centralize certain decisions because we want those decisions to be made by someone who's got the overview of the whole company and who understands the risk readiness in the organization. What's our willingness to take risk? So this is one example, and there are 4 or 5 drivers of requisite agility in an organization. So contextual leadership is very much about understanding, how do we set our organization up to respond most effectively to the external environment, given our strategy and operating model, and what do we do to involve people in making that happen? Which skills, which cultural subcultures do we need to work on? And that's the shaping part of contextual leadership.
So this is almost taking the uncertainty or the fluidity of the context and actually, I suppose, be more proactive of how we shape that. How can we not control it, because it's not about control, more about how we can, I suppose, get to a place where it flows in the way that the context is flowing with what's happening. Have you got an example where you've worked with an organization, it might be, or your previous roles you've been in, where things have been so fluid, and how the organizational sort of leadership team has adapted for that context and enabled those leadership members to really sort of flow and really do well for that organization?
Absolutely. I've been in several of those projects or situations. So let's take one example. We have a large-scale internationally working organization based in Europe, but facing a lot of the turmoil that's going on right now. They were also represented in some of the Eastern countries, including Ukraine, when the war came up. And what they found was that they needed to build a range of contingent responses. So what we did was that we shifted their strategy work towards more scenario planning. We then started saying, how can we start to uncouple? So there's interdependency. That's one of the organizational factors that you need to consider. How can we start to uncouple the different parts of the operation, rather than having very integrated and very highly interdependent units? We try to uncouple that in order for us to then allow the parts of the organization that was actually not that influenced by the turmoil to stay operating, stay focused on efficiency and effective operation, and the other parts to build more contingency, contingent responses, agility, empowering the front line, de-risking the organization by shifting the geography. So this is very much about understanding that when you lead, you need to start by saying, but what are the contextual drivers here? The main contextual driver that came up was that dynamism came up or rose. That means it became more unpredictable. Risk intensity went up very, very much in certain countries. And at the same time, we needed to look at the inside and say, we had built a way of operating that was very interdependent. And that meant that that integrated supply chain was challenged because of this. So we needed to start debunking that. And that's an example of working on the structural side. At the same time, we needed to work with the empowerment culture, which is one of the subcultures that you can work on, with the people in those geographies so that they got higher freedom of operation because they were the only ones close enough to make the right judgment calls. So they succeeded building that. It took them a year in really hard work, and they are successfully operating their business now with basically two parts of the organization. One that runs in a very stable environment, and a part of the organization that is much more working with scenario planning and contingent responses.
Sounds interesting. How did you sort of, I suppose, decouple or separate those interdependencies? Because that would have been quite a cultural thing, quite embedded in ways of working, and that's how the organizations worked. And how did you sort of do that? And what were the challenges of doing that with the people and taking people on that sort of journey?
So first of all, here the reason for introducing a transformation, a change, was clear. So that made it a bit easier because people understood that we need to become something different than what we are. Then when you go into working with culture, the way that you do that, one of the things that I found in the research behind the contextual leadership concept is that if you go out with operating principles, guiding principles, and you involve people in saying, if we want to make these guiding principles come alive and act our way into a new culture, then people, through that involvement, saying we're going to do more of this, less of that, really convert that cultural code into something that they can own. And then we can start running cycles, learning cycles that drive our culture in that direction. We need to remind ourselves that cultures constantly reproduced. So we can do a lot from a leadership perspective of shaping the culture into a certain direction. So we had a very, very clear, and still have a very clear track on the cultural side. At the same time, we shifted roles. So we shifted mandates in order to release the interdependencies. We started building, rather than having everything concentrated in one location, we started working with having similar operations, similar competencies, similar capacity in more than one location. So that's another way of decoupling the interdependence. So a lot of work with the structures, a lot of work with the culture, the empowerment culture, but at the same time also some upskilling of the people base in those locations so that they could start covering for each other's functions. So a lot of initiatives, but again, 3-4 contextual factors, focus on those and then start working through involvement.
Did that add any costs because you were getting that similar roles in different areas, but also did that create, I suppose, an efficiency challenge as well?
Yeah, that it changed the operating cost because the very, very high level of efficiency needs to be balanced by the risk readiness that is necessary to counter the risk intensity. So when you move towards a more risk-intensive environment, you do incur some cost in order to get the right safety culture, the right safety measures the right contingency level so that you've got that readiness. And that means that, yes, the cost picture did shift. Do they still have a profitable operation? Yes. Could they deselect being in some of these geographies? Yes, they could, but it's in their values that they also take care of their employees, and that it's very important for them that they take that in their purpose, that they take part of that responsibility. So that's the reason of operating now with a higher risk provision, if you will.
And it's great that they aligned it to their intentional, their purpose, but also their values, which obviously are almost like the guardrails, aren't they, in terms of working through an organization, and probably and anticipate this enable them to be more sustainable going forward. But just obviously the operating model had changed, but it's sometimes it has to change for the context. That's what you're doing, and I think that's where people sometimes struggle with the shift that you have to do, and there is quite a shift and quite a change with that. Many leaders obviously are encouraged to be consistent in their approach, consistent in their language, in their messaging, in how they treat people, their behaviors. And when you look at contextual leadership, how do you balance that consistency with what contextual leadership creates, that flexibility, and almost that you talked about one of your pillars is that where you're adapting and changing, and how does that consistency principle run through without sort of distorting it in the context of contextual leadership?
So first of all, it's a splendid question, because it is a very, very important part of leadership that you've got your authenticity. And authenticity is necessary for all leaders. The way you build authenticity is that you adhere to consistent principles, that you stay true to those principles so that people can predict what can they expect from you as a leader. So it's about understanding my value drivers, aligning them with the company's value drivers. It is about managing exceptions. So when there is exceptions, that you are clear about why are we making this choice, explaining it. Sense making is so crucial to authenticity. And the other part is managing expectations, so I know what I can expect from my leader. So that authenticity forms a base rhythm. On top of that base rhythm, I need to lead in context. And that means that when I go into the production line, I need to be exercising more close leadership, because here it's repeatability, it is consistency, it is standard operating procedure. That's the value driver. Then I move into the marketing department. Here I need to move from closed leadership to more opening leadership, because we need to innovate, we need to find different ways, we need to come up with ideas that kind of entice the customers to get interested and so forth. So that little contextual difference of what are they pursuing, what's the value driver in supply chain, and what's the value driver in marketing. I need to understand that, but that doesn't change my authenticity. It doesn't change the way I make decisions about paradoxes or value-driven dilemmas. So the approach needs to fit the purpose, the objective, and the people that you meet. At the same time, of course, you need to stay true to the way you lead as a leader. Does that make sense, that balance, Julian?
Yeah, and it does, and it'd be interesting just your understanding of that example where you had the factory versus the marketing department. Each of those individuals that would get experience of you, would they get different experiences? So the marketing get a different experience of you versus the manufacturing.
So they would have the same experience in regards to what I stand for. So how do I want people to treat each other? How do I want to build relationships? How do I want us to interact? We need a common ground about the collaboration culture. Mm-hmm. But they will experience a difference in what I require from them. My focus on innovating, ideation, Critical thinking in marketing is different than it is in the continuous improvement mindset that's in production. The same variation will also be there when I lead the people that I lead in Denmark, and then I meet my colleagues in China. I need to understand that decision making, because of the authority orientation, is different in Denmark and China, but we still stand on the same values. So a traditional challenge for leaders is we want to give each other feedback. That's a part of our way of, because we want to learn together. But the way that you solicit feedback in the Nordic countries in Europe and the way you do it in Asia is different. But we still want people to give feedback for us to improve together and learn. So I need to find those style differences, but staying true to the mission and what I want to achieve. And that is to make sure we learn together.
And how is a leader, that difference between working with somebody in China versus Denmark? I know you talk about being authenticity and talking to your core values and who you are. Don't get, I suppose, challenged with almost a bit of schizophrenia in how they operate and get confused, or when you're trying to operate in a different context, it potentially can be quite exhausting. How do we minimize that? I suppose it's a difficult thing to do because you're possibly slightly out your comfort zone, you're slightly out your normal sort of way you operate. How have you found, if you help leaders to manage that?
So if we start by helping companies, and then we'll help leaders after that. So companies need to build common ground around their values, around the principles they adhere to. So that means that they need to do quite a bit of work of explaining and involving people in interpreting what does the values mean to us where we sit. So if we sit in India, or if we sit in the US, or if I'm in manufacturing, or if I'm in construction, then we need to involve people, onboard them, and have a repeated dialogue around how do we translate that. And that very often revolves around how do we collaborate, how do we voice our concerns or our feedback, and how do we work with empowerment. So these are base cultures. That common ground then allows us that when we lead people that have a different national anchor, to understand, embrace, and leverage that diversity. Because if we have common ground, that means we've got a strong meeting place, understanding what we have together. Then it makes it a lot easier to activate those critical different perspectives and benefit from that. So if the company is not building common ground strongly enough, all of a sudden, what will happen is that cultural differences risk fragmenting that starting point. So we do not benefit from diversity. We actually get diminishing return from diversity. And then there is a difference. If I, as a leader, move to France and I'm going to lead in a French company, then I need to start understanding the French culture a lot and then move towards that to connect enough, create common ground, and then lead from that. Whereas if it is a question of leading in an international setting where I go to India or I go to Denmark, then I need to rely on the common ground. So there is a misconception in cross-cultural understanding, believing that we should embrace and understand everything that's on the other side and accommodate with that. We need to embrace and understand it, and then we need to build common ground. It's the common ground that is the key to leveraging diversity and succeeding with an international business. Now, did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think it was really helpful, and I think it probably takes the stress out of that sort of cross-cultural type of working, is go for those common grounds. And I think it's finding that common ground rather than trying to think of every cultural differences and how can I modify my approach to meet that. I think there's an element of being aware, and I think and certainly not being naive to things like that, but certainly getting that sort of common ground is really helpful. I suppose just one final question for you is, if people are looking to implement more of this, and they're probably already in this place. People who are listening to it right now are already hearing this and thinking, I'm doing that. But what can be some, I suppose, common mistakes that you see organizations make when they're trying to sort of implement a more contextual leadership principles?
So one of the main things that happens in companies that struggle with aligning the way the organization work to what their intentions are is that they do a shift in strategy, or they merge with another company, or they make a change in their priorities, but they do not, in the management team, sit down and do a discussion of what is it actually in the context that sustains the patterns we've been operating by, and how do we move that? And then deliberately take one or two things and say, we're going to change that, and we're going to involve people in changing that. And in the Contextual Leader, the book that came after the research, there's a very easy, approachable way of involving the organization. So the key thing here is that they think about a new strategy or a change or transformation, but they fail to do the proper involvement work throughout the organization, put leadership behind it, and involve people in those interpretation cycles. If you do that, you can shape the organization. You can make this happen. If you do not, you will have an organization that is sustaining patterns that are not fully fit for purpose. And that means that you will be lagging behind. And there are a lot of examples of this. So it's really about taking it seriously, that you need organizational alignment that can only happen through mobilization and involvement. You can't tell an organization to align. You can only do that by mobilization and involvement.
No, that's really helpful for people to hear. And I just want to thank you for coming on the show, Torben, and sharing your insights. I think people hopefully will be provoked to think a bit more about it, as well as learnt from what you've shared. If people want to get in touch with you or connect with you, what's the best way of doing that?
So the best and easiest way to remember, I think, is to go to thecontextualleader.com. That's the landing page for information about my research and information about the book. Here you can also download a few free excerpts, and you can find all my contact information. Also, you can absolutely find me on LinkedIn, and I encourage everyone to connect. I talk about this, I'm interested in this, and I will be happy to hear from people who are challenged or have got perspectives on this. So, and one last thing is that the contextualleader.com, soon we will also launch an AI version of the book, so that you can actually have a discussion with an AI bot that can enrich your thinking, making it a bit easier to grasp all the dimensions of leadership context.
Wow, fascinating. Using the wonderful generative AI to help people. That's brilliant. That's brilliant. That's really good. Well, thank you for your time today, Torben.
Thank you.